Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to call to order this regularly scheduled meeting of the Intergovernmental Relations Committee. My name is Andrew Johnson. I'm the chair of the committee, and I'm joined today by a quorum of our committee members, Councilmember Schrader, Vice Chair Jenkins, Councilmember Reich, and Council President Bender. We have before us 6 items today, 3 of which are on consent. So I will note that item number 3 on consent, we are going to postpone a cycle so that there can be some additional work on the language and so that the council members representing the area can be here for that as well. So I will go ahead and move the consent items with the postponement of item number 3. And I'll quick mention consent item number 1, read those off for those that are watching, is some amendments to our legislative positions regarding our support for the funding to stay and remain with the U.S. Bank Stadium Reserve Funds so that it enables future options for refinancing, increasing our support for the transit projects from $50 million to $80 million, and as well supporting some great nonprofit projects that are seeking either cash or bonding funding this year at the legislature. So I've made that motion and wanted to see if any of my colleagues have any comments or questions on any of those items. Not Council President Bender, yes.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chair. Did you move the whole consent agenda?
No. So I moved items 1 and 2, and then item 3, a postponement for a cycle.
Perfect. Thank you. That's what I just wanted. I thought that's what you said, and then I just wanted to make sure.
Absolutely.
Just a brief comment on that. I think that would make this come back to IGR. We have the chair of the TBW committee here, so I think that makes sense. I think we could potentially check in about whether or not it needs to go back to TBW as well, but I know Councilmember Reich and I have both had conversations with the 2 council members from wards 4 and 5, and just there's a desire to have more time to make sure that the resolution just really says very clearly what the city's position is. So in my mind, it seems fine to just come back to IGR, but thought I'd make that comment. Thanks.
Thank you, Councilmember Reich.
Yeah, I think that'd be fully appropriate. I think it was vetted in committee. It's a pretty well vetted document. We do want to make sure that people that are impacted express themselves in addition to committee work. And so coming back here would be very appropriate in my mind.
Thank you. Any additional comments, questions on any of those items? Not seeing any more. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, the motion carries. We'll move on to our first discussion item, number 4, which is redistricting ward boundaries following the 2020 census. Mr. Carl.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair. As you noted, my name is Casey Carl. I have the privilege of serving as clerk for the city of Minneapolis. I'm here today to continue the initial discussion, what we began at the committee's last regular meeting, which was February 12th. This is about redistricting and its impact on future municipal elections. I'm joined here with the Intergovernmental Relations Director, Mr. Ranieri, and Assistant City Attorney Carolyn Bachun. As a general refresher for the committee, redistricting is the legally required process of redrawing electoral boundaries every 10 years after a federal census. An important objective of redistricting is to ensure fair political representation at all levels of government. As a consequence, the sequencing and the timing of redistricting is important because of its impact on the conduct of elections. The formal process begins when official census results data is received on April 1st in 2021, and in all cases, new boundaries must be redrawn no later than 19 weeks prior to the date of the statewide primary in the year that ends in 2 after each census. So in this case, that hard deadline that we cannot miss is March 29th, 2022. That's established under Minnesota statutes, section 204B.135. We discussed the impact of the Kahn Rule in the first presentation, which is codified as Minnesota statutes, section 205.84. In essence, the Kahn Rule requires that the city complete its redistricting and conduct a municipal election in the year ending in either 2 or 3 after each census. And this stands in conflict with the regular 4-year cycle for municipal elections that we have in place today. The effect is that it would have 2 consecutive 2-year terms every 20 years in a pattern when the regular municipal election falls in the year ending in 1 after each census, as it does this time. A further complication is that this rule applies only to half of our municipal ballot. It's just to the 13 members of the city council. The rule does not apply to the mayor, who is popularly elected from a single district which encompasses the entire population. Likewise, and unique to the city of Minneapolis, this rule does not apply to the Minneapolis Park Board nor to the Board of Estimate and Taxation. So that's roughly half of our ballot that is not subject to the Kahn Rule. And that creates an additional hurdle for the city of Minneapolis, since it's the only local jurisdiction in Minnesota have an elected park board and a board of estimate and taxation. And under current law, there is a separate timeline for redrawing the subordinate political boundaries tied to those other entities. So while the Charter Commission is responsible for drawing city wards and park districts, the City Council is responsible for establishing precincts. And so the statutory deadline for the creation of precincts is the same as that for redrawing city wards. So we need to make sure that those processes are aligned and that they happen concurrently.
Mr. Carl, we have a question or comment from Council Vice President Jenkins.
Chair Johnson, Mr. Casey, I'm just curious, the other two bodies that you named, the Board of Estimate and Taxation, as well as the Park Board, will their boundaries be sort of inconsistent with the constituents that voted for them as well?
So, Mr. Chair, I understand the question from the Vice President is for those that have districts, much like the council has wards, those populations would be drawn from numbers from a decade ago because they're not subject to the Kahn Rule, which requires a faster redistricting using the new updated census numbers. That does not apply to the Board of Estimate and Taxation. Both of those seats are elected at large, like the mayor. So population changes do not affect the Board of Estimate and Taxation. However, they would affect the Park Board because the Park Board is made up of a mix of 3 at large and then 6 by district. So the 6 by district are analogous to the 13 wards of the city council. But again, the Kahn Rule does not apply to the Park Board. So I've answered part of that question. I guess the further piece is, yes, at this point we would be drawing park boards, park districts using older census data prior to the next regular election. And then they would have new districts drawn using the new census data in 2025.
So for clarity, and maybe this is just an opinion or not, but the Kahn Rule really only addresses the city council elected officials and leaves the rest of, so the intent is to have fair representation. However, it doesn't apply to other elected office holders.
Through the chair to the council vice president, it doesn't apply to any of the other municipal offices in Minneapolis, including the 6 park commissioners elected by district. It does only apply to the 13 council members. And there might be some additional conversation about why the distinction between those. The city council is the legislative body of the city, and it is the chief policymaking body of the city. The park board is a governing body of a very specific district. It has lesser power. And so although it is an elected body, it doesn't have the general grant of legislative authority at the local level that the council does. And it also is made up of,
i.e. taxation, et cetera.
The park board has taxation powers, but our charter is actually a grant of statutory, or I shouldn't say statutory, it is a grant of the state's power to be exercised at the local level, and it vests that power in the city council primarily. So there is a difference in terms of the bodies that are elected by the people, and then furthermore, there is a difference in the composition. The council is 13 members, each elected from separate wards. The park board is a board that is constituted out of 3 at-large, meaning every voter in the city gets a chance to elect those 3 seats, and then in addition thereto, there are 6 districts. So the composition of the park board is different than it is of the council. This is also why the Kahn Rule would not affect, as an example, the city of Duluth. The city of Duluth elects council members by wards, but they also have a mix of at-large, and they stagger their elections. Because of those factors, Kahn does not apply. Kahn applies to cities of the first class where all council members are elected by ward at the same time.
Thank you, Mr. Casey. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I'll note that we've been joined by Councilmember Orsami. And also, to that point, I think Council President raised this last time that there are a lot of other cities that aren't of the first class across Minnesota that this law does not resolve that issue for. So, Council President Pender.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm glad you mentioned that because I think I maybe caused some confusion, maybe in that discussion or another one when I mentioned the city attorney's report. And my intention of doing that was to highlight some of the real challenges that this law is creating, which this presentation is highlighting a lot of changes that we would need to make in order to comply with the law, both to the law itself and our city's charter. But also because I do think that there's some underlying questions about the law's effectiveness at reaching the goals that it's stated to address. And so I think over time, we are really the first city that's, the law was written to apply only to city council members in Minneapolis, essentially. But my hope is that as this conversation proceeds over the years, if the real goal is to make sure that every Minnesotan is represented in their local government, that law would apply to all of our communities, and that we would still maintain local control over our own election cycles, as does every other community in the state. So I think these underlying questions around, how our voters are represented in their local democracy are really important. And I think we're going to do our very best to reach the goals that we are working on setting out this time. But I suspect that this conversation will continue past 2021 and 2023. I suspect that there may be issues and challenges that are experienced by voters or folks, seeing the consequences of this result. And so I think those conversations will continue beyond just this first pass at trying to comply with the law. So that was a long comment, but I did say, Mr. Call, maybe before you, it doesn't have to be right now, but before you head into the two options, I do think it's worth pausing and just giving us once again, a real brief overview of the status quo and why these options are necessary, because it is important to remember that both state law and our city charter need to change in order for these options to be viable, and left unchanged, there's a scenario 0 that we are hoping to avoid. So thanks.
To the chair, I will say my presentation is a continuation of the presentation that began on February 12th, and I'm sort of bringing us up to speed and talking about the two plans. The next presentation is also a continuation of this, and Assistant City Attorney Carolyn Bachun will be in front of you to really walk through all of those specific details of the number of charter changes, what are they, the statutory changes we'd recommend, and so that presentation will provide a lot of that depth or context that you're asking for.
Great.
So this slide then in front of the committee shows an overall timeline for the city's redistricting process. You've seen this before. Pardon. The first statutory deadline for completing local redistricting is 60 days after action by the state legislature. So that's the default is 60 days when the state legislature acts, the city must complete redistricting. If the city is to complete its redistricting work in 2021, as has been discussed, then all final actions to draw new ward boundaries and to establish precincts within those boundaries must be done no later than 14 days before the opening of candidate filing for that year's election. So candidate filing next year in 2021 will open on July 27th. 14 days before that is July 13th. So the drop-dead deadline for us to finish redistricting and the drawing of precincts in 2021 in advance of the next regular municipal election is July 13th. But in order to complete that entire scope of work, in order to publish those new political boundaries, and to ensure that all of that information is widely circulated throughout the community, especially to voters and candidates alike, I have suggested to the Charter Commission that any effort to complete redistricting in 2021 should be done no later than June 30th. That gives us a little extra buffer should any challenges occur. If redistricting cannot be completed by no later than July 13th, then we will be moving forward to complete redistricting in the year ending in 2. And in that case, all redistricting must be completed no later than 19 weeks before the statewide primary in that year. So again, that hard deadline in which point all redistricting has to be completed, shown on this slide, is March 29th. So as I've noted at the previous committee meeting, staff have tracked various plans to address municipal elections within the requirements of the Kahn Rule, as well as other both charter and statutory requirements, as the president of council has noted. The short answer here, as I said before, is there are no easy answers. None of these situations is perfect. But what we've done, bringing forward from last meeting on February 12th, is to try and frame up a policy framework to identify the specific objectives that staff would recommend against which any redistricting plan would be evaluated. So as a related action, we're requesting feedback from the committee and ultimate approval by the council to approve a policy framework that would guide our discussions and decisions around a final plan. And remembering again that we need to ensure alignment between the Charter Commission, which draws the wards, and the City Council, which draws the precincts. So this slide presents the 5 policy objectives that were identified by staff. They work in tandem. They're listed in priority order. And again, I will say here that these were developed by staff. They were presented for the very first time to the committee at its last meeting on February 12th. I believe that we've covered the major issues, but certainly we would be open to considering any additional factors that should be added as part of this policy framework. Quickly to review, we think that any redistricting proposal should focus on the following options. First and foremost, of course, we need to ensure compliance with all applicable laws, both for redistricting and elections, and of course that includes the Kahn Rule. Second, we believe that the city should ensure a consistent and predictable election cycle for municipal elections so that voters, candidates, campaigns, and others can depend on that schedule, that it's not subject to frequent change or irregularity, and with as few deviations as possible. Third, we believe it's important to preserve, to the extent possible, the existing unified municipal ballot that encompasses all 25 offices. That includes the mayor, 13 council wards, 6 park districts, 3 at-large park seats, and 2 at-large seats for the Board of Estimate and Taxation. Then relatedly, the fourth objective we identified was to minimize any additional expenses for separate elections that would cover only the 13 council wards, not to mention the potential for lower vote turnout with a limited election. And finally, our fifth objective is a preference to pursue alternatives that reduce the number of substantive legislative changes, both at the state and with the charter, that would be necessary. By this, we mean we want to prioritize alternatives that have a realistic chance for success, but which also satisfy all of those other objectives. So with these in mind, staff would present its findings against 2 alternative plans that we discussed at the last meeting. I'll review those briefly, and then Ms. Bachun will provide the legal analysis of those plans. This first alternative plan, staff essentially modified, I call it the no change approach. There's little change in terms of its effect to voters under this scenario. There is a provision that would allow for an additional election if necessary in a year ending in 3 when the regular election cycle ends in the year ending in 1 following a census. This option would only be exercised if the city was unable to complete redistricting in time for that regular election in the year ending in 1. So I've referred to this extra election in the year ending in 3 as a midterm because its effect is to cut short the election and create a two-year cycle, a two-year term. If required, that midterm election would be limited, as I mentioned, to a single 2-year term. Council members would then stand for election again in the regular municipal election ending in 2025, along with the rest of the municipal ballot. This option does not avoid extra costs for the midterm election if we can't get redistricting done. If we get redistricting done in the year ending in 1, then we avoid the election in the year ending in 3. So there is the potential for an additional cost. That's why I've put the fourth criteria, minimizing the expense, in yellow here. Under this alternative, there are some technical corrections both at the state level and with the city charter that we would recommend. Again, Ms. Bachun will going over those to help clarify the legal intent and principles. So that, again, is why that is yellow on the 5th. So as you can see, 2 of the 5 factors that we identified, our policy objectives, are green. They fully satisfy those objectives. 3 of them are yellow. They partially satisfy the objective, but not fully. And that's because the unified ballot could be broken if we had to have an election in the year ending in 3 that would include an additional approximate $3 million for an election. And the changes are still required, but they're not extensive at the law with both the charter and the statute. The second alternative shown here, Plan 2, is much more substantive. So if the first option is what I call no significant change, this is pretty significant change. This would change the set terms for all offices on the ballot to specific years. So regular elections would be conducted in the years ending in 1, 3, and 7. It essentially creates a pattern of regular elections that match the Minnesota Senate. So there'd be a 2-year term in the year ending in 1, there'd be a 4-year term ending in 3, and a 4-year term ending in 7. If this cycle were in place, then we would well live within the Kahn Rule because we would have the elections both in 1 and 3, so we would have satisfied that. The difficulty here is that over a I shouldn't say difficulty, the reality is that it doesn't minimize our expense because over the 20-year period, you would for sure have a 6th election. Under the first plan, you're guaranteed 5 with a possibility of 6. This guarantees 6 elections. So it has a slightly higher cost associated with it. And the other thing is that this requires more substantive changes in terms of the ballot itself, and as I've mentioned, that's because half the ballot currently is not subject to Kahn. So going forward to change the terms for the other half of the ballot, the mayor, the entire park board, and the BET, would be fairly significant and extensive to achieve. So I've marked that as red on the 5th objective. I'd note again, as I did at the February 12th committee meeting, the Charter Commission is pursuing alternative number 1, and they are not considering alternative number 2. The Charter Commission also is formulating a potential charter amendment to address the impact of the Kahn Rule within the city charter. So that doesn't necessarily address statutory changes that Ms. Bachun will be discussing, but it would resolve and address the Kahn Rule within our charter. The intent is that that ballot question could be submitted to voters this November in the presidential general election on November 3rd. They have scheduled a public hearing on that ballot question at their next regular meeting, which is next Wednesday, March 4th, in this chamber at 4 o'clock. So that completes my summary of the alternatives that we've presented in the policy objective framework. Mr. Chair, what we're hoping to get is some direction from the committee on that policy framework that was presented. Does the model that staff prepared meet your expectations? Are there other factors that we should add going forward? Also then, if the committee has any input on a preferred alternative, again, remembering that we need to stitch the charter and the city council together in terms of completing the entire scope of work. And I did mention that the Charter Commission has a hearing at its next meeting on March 4th. That completes my presentation as it's been prepared, feedback from last time. As I mentioned, Ms. Bachun is next with a fuller legal analysis. I would like to end, Mr. Chair, just by saying publicly to the committee, with your support, we've talked about bringing forward regular reports to this committee so that we can ensure that stitching together an alignment between the Charter Commission, which meets once monthly, and this committee, which meets twice monthly. So hopefully we can have those meetings added as a regular feature to the IGR committee meeting and bring back to you more information both from the Charter Commission and from staff as we continue down this path.
Excellent. Well, thank you for the presentation and covering, again, all the reasons why we're here and the options available before us on this. It's a big deal in terms of the amount of staff time that has gone into even coming to this point to have these recommendations and all the thought that went into the policy framework. I would venture to say hundreds of hours, perhaps more than that, but it just goes to show the complexity of this and how technical this is. So I'll go ahead and, oh yes, Council Vice Chair Jenkins.
Thank you, Chair Johnson. I believe I know the answer to this question. However, I'm going to pose it anyway. Is there any financial assistance from our state legislature to help implement this mandated shift in our elections?
Mr. Chair, to the Vice President's question, I am unaware of any funding being provided to any cities. The city of St. Paul went through this transition in its regular election in 2011 and received no assistance that I'm aware of from the state.
I just wanted that to be a part of our public record. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate that. Vice Chair Jenkins, I think that's a great point to add to this. So I'll go ahead and move that we approve the policy framework as recommended by staff, along with alternative number 1 as the recommended redistricting alternative, and see if there's any discussion or questions or thoughts on that. Council President Bender.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I support without any hesitation the staff identified policy objectives, and really appreciate the clarity and the work that went into really drilling down, and also the kind of nuance added with these layers of how we're using them as a guiding tool. I do see the direction that this is heading, and it's pretty clear that it is toward alternative 1. I do think that for the, kind of to my earlier comments, I think for this first pass at complying with the law, it's worth trying this approach, which allows the opportunity to redistrict in the way that St. Paul did when they complied in time for their election. That will require some shifts that I think might come as a surprise to voters or potential candidates like we talked about last time. I suspect that having a special election in 2023 is a pretty likely scenario, and I think voters are gonna have, I'm not sure how voters' experience will be with that cycle. So I suspect, depending on how this goes, the conversation will be revisited after the 2021 or 2023 election. I still think there are a lot of benefits to plan number 2, in terms of clarity, in terms of, to the Council Vice President's point, consistency across the different elected bodies. I think it creates a clear pattern for voters that reflects some of the patterns at the state, so they're not unfamiliar to voters. I'm willing to support option 1. Again, I think that is the direction that that this body and the Charter Commission are clearly heading. I'm a little disappointed that we haven't had more willingness from some of the other potentially affected offices in collaborating. The city council is going to have change no matter what. The question was, will it affect the mayor's election, the park board, and the board of estimate and taxation? And again, I think for the amount of benefit that it could have had to voters, it was a little disappointing not to see more open-mindedness from those other bodies and collaborating on a schedule. So those are my thoughts about this. Again, appreciate you moving this forward and appreciate your leadership along with staff in the council, shepherding the council to taking a position on this important issue, because we're at the stage where we really need to start getting to work. If the Charter Commission is kind of taking up at their next meetings the discussion they've been having, they're really weighing the pros and cons of doing more community engagement around redistricting, and therefore making it less likely that they would hit that 2021 deadline, and making it more likely there'd be a 2023 election, versus moving faster in order to keep that 2021 election a 4-year term. So that will be an important conversation that I'm sure council members will want to weigh in on. I hope our constituents will weigh in on. I know it's pretty in the weeds, but we do have some great organizations who I think are paying attention, the League of Women Voters and others, that I think will be able to bring some of that voter voice to the table, which I think is really helpful. So this is a big deal. And just final thought, I do want to just reemphasize again that in order to do Plan 1 requires a lot of changes, including to the state law itself. Mm-hmm. So this relies on the legislature, honoring our local jurisdiction over our own elections, our hard work to comply with the law that they set forth without any funding or assistance to comply. And it really is important that that happen, because the alternative is ending up with an offset election cycle. That would be the city council standing for election, and then the mayor, park board, and BET standing for election 2 years later, and then the city council 2 years after that, and then the other 3 offices after that in perpetuity. having the city council offset from those other offices on the ballot. And I think that would be the worst case scenario for our voters and have real impacts on governance at the city. At the very least, if that change happens, we need to have significantly more community engagement and more community conversation about what that governance change would be like for our community. So thanks again for all the hard work on this, and appreciate the opportunity to weigh in. I know we're all doing our best to weigh what would be best for our constituents and best for the city enterprise as we go forward to comply with this law.
Thank you for the comments. Any additional comments from committee members? I just think you have highlighted, and I appreciate the comments, a lot of the different challenges with this. There's really trade-offs with each one of these things, and I think it is very likely that we will end up having to go with plan number one, depending on how things go with redistricting. But I think aspirationally, it really makes sense, and that we also recognize that since the last redistricting, we have a lot of data. We live in a very data-rich world right now, and a lot of that work can be front-loaded. Yep. And so we can have very extensive community engagement and people feeling very informed and understanding exactly where things are going to land once everything's officially in. And I think that it makes a lot of sense from that standpoint. But again, there's trade-offs with all of this. I was thinking about the conversation last time. There's this thought of, potentially, as people are even thinking about if they would want to run, if they're on the border, and looking at that timeline, could that impact their decisions? And then just as likely, if we had an election in 2023, that's the flip side of that is somebody who could become a new council member in 2021 could find out within 2 months, essentially, that they're no longer going to be representing the ward that they live in. And so there are a lot of different trade-offs that are involved with this. And even as we discussed, the very real likelihood that then individuals would be running for re-election before they even vote on their first budget. And potentially with biennial budgeting, it could be even more dramatic than that, where they essentially go their first term all the way through another election before getting an opportunity to vote on their first budget. And so, there's just a lot of trade-offs involved with this, and we're trying our best to make the most of the situation so that it's as positive for voters, it's as positive for the public and for the governance of the city as possible. So any additional comments or questions from colleagues? Not seeing any? Oh, Council President Bender.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You highlighted something that I think is really important that I know the clerk's office and others are also working on, which is reviewing what happened during our last redistricting process, which was very unique in its values-led goals and the amount of community engagement that happened, and taking what lessons could be learned from that and then front-loading that process earlier. So regardless of whether or not, no matter what happens with option one scenarios, I think there's a lot of value in doing engagement around values-driven approach to redistricting, to communicating about redistricting earlier on. So, I think just wanted to highlight that point that a lot was learned in that unique last redistricting process that I think we'll carry forward and we'll see the benefits of for a long time because it was such a big change, but also that could be drawn on to do the community engagement work that I think is even starting now with staff talking about a timeline for that. And so appreciate it.
Mr. Chair, if I can just on that one point, there is a very large deep bench of staff working across multiple departments on this time, as the council president just noted. We're hopeful to be able to bring forward our recommendations on community engagement, education, and outreach to the Charter Commission sometime in April, I think is what we're looking at, April or May. So it'd be that same time frame we'd be back with these regular reports to share that with you as well, so that you also have, on behalf of your constituents and your communities, a chance to see what that looks like and also help us to shape a process that is inclusive and is getting into the community as far as possible.
Absolutely. Thank you. Any further comments? Not seeing any. All those in favor of the motion, please say aye. Those opposed, that carries.
So, Mr. Chair, at this time, the next agenda item will be led by Assistant City Attorney Carol Bachun, who will bring up, we passed out copies of this presentation to each of you at the desk, and then I would also offer for members of the public there are extra copies with the clerk.
Great. Welcome, Ms. Bachun.
Thank you. Chair Johnson, members of the committee. I would just like to talk to you. I did provide you with a document that I'd like to be received and filed. It's a summary of the statutory and charter amendments. I did provide you those possible amendments for both options, so I'll just talk about the first option since that's what we're going to be looking at. So the amendments, I wanted to let you know, those amendments apply not just for right now, not just for after the 2020 census, they're going to apply into the future. So there's a lot of work being done up front, but it's going to be useful for decades from now. And I have worked on some statutory changes, and those are going to be set out so that any city could use it. So whether a city is, it has elections in even-numbered years or odd-numbered years, I'm drafting that so that it can be useful to all of the cities. One of the first, this is for the option one that you've chosen. One of the first statutes I want to talk about is Section 205.07. What that does is that that particular statute does say that a council member term is 4 years. Just to let you know, the statutes say that mayor's term is either 2 or 4 years, but for council members, it's just a pure 4 years. So I know I did provide the Charter Commission with a legal opinion saying that, well, under the Kahn Amendment, I believe that if we have an election in the year ending, an election in 2023, it's likely under the law going to be considered to be a 2-year term. But I just want to clarify that in the statute. I don't want to wait till the last minute and have any litigation. I believe that's going to be the case, that it would be a 2-year term, but I want to make sure that the statute says the same thing. Now, Section 205.84, that's basically what we call the Kahn Amendment. I mean, the Kahn Amendment is within that. And so I'm going to be talking about some portions of that Kahn Amendment. That amendment says that if a city of the first class, like the city of Minneapolis, has an election, and what we find is that there's been a 5% change of population in any ward, then we have to have an election in either the year ending in 2 or 3. What I found out when Casey put together a group of people to work on redistricting, what I found out in some of those discussions was that there's a difference of opinion as to what the statute means when it talks about the 5% change in population. People had different views as to how you determine what the 5% is, what numbers you use to calculate. So what I'm proposing is just to make it clear in the statute that what we'd be looking at, for example, now would be the population in a ward in 2020 compared to the population in that same ward in 2010. Was there a 5% or more population change? If so, then we would have to have this additional election in the year ending in 2 or 3, according to the Kahn Amendment. Also, like I said, I wanted to clarify that after an election in 2023, if needed, we would have a 2-year term. And then also, under the Kahn Amendment, I think it was just an oversight by the legislature, but there were changes that were going on in 2010 and 2011 in a couple different statutes. And one statute said that, now cities of the first class can redistrict in the year ending in 1. But the Kahn Amendment didn't say, well, what happens if you do redistrict in the year ending in 1 and you have an election in the year ending in 1 with those new ward boundaries? The Kahn Amendment doesn't address that. It just says, hey, if you don't have an election in the year ending in 2 or 3, you have to have the election. So I want to make it clear, and this is within the spirit of the Kahn Amendment, that if for some reason we get the redistricting done early in the year ending in 1, we have the election in the year ending in 1 with those new ward boundaries, that we do not have to have the election in the year ending in 2 or 3. So like I said, I think it was an oversight by the legislature. I just want to clarify that. I want to talk about this particular section, 204.135. I just want to talk to you. This is one of those changes that was made in like 2010, 2011. It allowed cities of the first class to do the redistricting in the year ending in 1. So if we would do that, we would establish the boundaries in 2021. Then the next step that would happen would be that the legislature would do their redistricting. After the city gets those boundary lines for the legislature, then we would have to look at our ward boundaries against those legislative boundaries and see if there's like little slivers of precincts that we would have to have. Say, for example, a legislative line is 1 block away from a ward line. Well, technically we can have a precinct, but what's the point of that? So the statute allows us to make those little minor changes, so we don't have to have those very small, unique precincts. So that's just what 204B.135 is all about. So I want to amend that. I want to allow park districts to be reestablished in the year ending in 1 also. Right now, that law was created so that you can only reestablish the wards in the year ending in 1. And then after the legislature makes does their redistricting, then you can make those small minor modifications. But I want that to happen also with the park districts, because the Charter Commission redistricts not only the not only the wards, but also the park districts. So to be in sync, I think we need to make sure that that change is done too. And I think it might have been an oversight with the legislature. The other thing I would like to clarify is that if we would redistrict in the year ending in 2 after the legislature redistricts, typically the statute will say there's a 1 week period to appeal that plan. So if somebody doesn't like how we've drawn the wards, they'd have 1 week to file something in district court to say this is not a proper these are not proper boundary lines for the wards. But once the statute allowed things to be redistricted in the year ending in 1, there wasn't clearly language as to when can you appeal that. So I just want to clarify that that's also a 1 week time to appeal if we redistrict in the year ending in 1 and the Charter Commission approves a plan. It's 1 week to file in district court. And the same would be true for modification. Like I said, if we redistrict in the year ending in 1, and then the legislature redistricts and we have to make those small minor modifications, in the statute, there's nothing saying if somebody can appeal those minor modifications. So let's clarify that. Let's give people, again, 1 week to appeal that, which I think would be highly unlikely, but it's possible. But let's have that in the statute so we know what we can and cannot do. And then with option 1, there would be some changes to the charter provisions also. Some of these charter provisions you'll see will kind of be similar to the statutory changes. So this one is similar to section 204B.135. Basically, we want to put in the charter provision that we would allow the redistricting early for both wards and park districts. I know the statutes right now don't allow us to do that early with the park districts, but we want to have them in sync and ready to rock and roll when we get those statutory changes done. And also, the Charter Commission right now, there's provisions in the charter about public hearings. For your basic redistricting, there should be 4 public hearings. But it doesn't say anything about what happens, like if we do redistrict in the year ending in 1, and then after the legislature redistricts, we have to make some minor modifications. It doesn't say anything about that. It's possible we don't need any public hearings. It's possible you could interpret the charter to require a couple public hearings for changes to the park districts. But I think it would be most appropriate to allow the Charter Commission to be able to decide, well, we made this one little minor modification, maybe they even chat with the park board, I don't know. But I'm just saying it, I think we need to have something in the charter that says, hey, maybe the Charter Commission can make that determination whether they want to have another public hearing or not on those minor modifications. And then the next one is Section 3.2 of the Minneapolis Charter. Now that is similar to the Kahn Amendment to Section 205.84, and it also yesterday I was with some members of the Charter Commission, and we were looking at some possible charter language because they're, as Casey Carl said, they're contemplating possibly going to the voters with a change to the charter. The Charter Commission wasn't as interested in putting details in the charter about how the 5% change in population would be calculated, but I think it's worthwhile to put in the statute. So that probably wouldn't be a part of the charter changes. But also part of the charter change would be that after the 2023 election, then that would be a 2-year term, to clarify that. And when there's an election in the year ending in 1 and we use new ward boundaries that we created in the year ending in 1, we don't have to have that election in the year ending in 2 or 3. And Section 4.2, that is similar to the statutory changes of 205.07. Basically, we would want to say that, right now the charter says that it's generally a 4-year term it's a 4-year term for council members. We would like to amend it so that when we follow the Kahn Rule, that after, say, if we have an election in the year ending in 3 here, it would be 2023, that term would be for 2 years. So we want to make sure that that's clarified, that we can follow the Kahn Rule and do a 2-year term so that all of the offices are in sync from that point. And then there's only a couple minor changes to 8.2 and 8.3 just to clean it up. Right now, we talk about a regular election. That's like our regular every 4-year election. I'd like to get that in sync with the language of the statute. The statute talks about general and special elections, so I'd like to kind of get that in sync. So that it clarifies that it's a regular general election, not just a regular election, because that's what the charter is talking about. There's under 8.3, there's also some minor cleanup language. Right now it says that it says that redistricting does not affect the eligibility or term of an incumbent holding office when the plan takes effect. Well, technically the Kahn Amendment would kind of shorten that a term from 4 years to 2 years if we had that population change of 5% or more in a ward. So it would just be a minor cleanup. So I believe those are the last. That's basically it for the statutory and charter changes, and. We'll be working, and one of the things we're requesting is that you do direct IGR to go forward with some statutory changes, because these changes need to be done now, and we can't wait. So I'd like that direction to be made, and I'm working with Casey Carl and Jean Ranieri to set up some statutory changes that can be used for a bill. So the quicker we can get that direction, the best that would be for everyone.
Excellent. Thank you. Do we have any comments or questions from committee members on that? Well, I just want to express our gratitude for your careful analysis and scrutiny of all these different ways that this impacts us, and that we would need to have modifications in order to be in compliance and to make this work. So really appreciate it. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'll go ahead and move both the receiving and filing and direction that's listed on our agenda, directing staff to pursue amendments to applicable statutes and charter provisions related to redistricting and the conduct of municipal elections. Any discussion or questions from committee members? Council Vice Chair Jenkins.
Thank you, Chair Johnson. You know, I'm just really curious as to, is there thoughts or consideration for how we began to really talk to our constituencies and communities about this issue? There have been a number of newspaper articles that have been floating around this topic and questions, and I feel like we need a really coordinated communication strategy to be able to effectively lay out what is a pretty complicated subject matter for our residents to be able to discuss. Is there a plan for that?
Mr. Chair, pardon me, to the Council Vice President's question, yes. In fact, the staff group I mentioned is working right now on updating the city's website that has content about what is redistricting, how does the process work, not just in terms of the basics that we had out there 10 years ago, but really much more extensive in terms of how all of these things we've been discussing, the Kahn Rule, the additional potential for an election, affect community and constituents in particular. So we are working on the web as a backbone piece for a communications plan. And as I mentioned, we hope to come forward in the next month or so with a much more robust plan for actual outreach and education and engagement. But we are working now on updating that content. And certainly one of the things we've anticipated is, as part of that web content, a page of frequently asked questions, common answers, directing people to the statutes and how this will affect the drawing of new political boundaries in the city of Minneapolis. So it is on our radar. We're working on that and would anticipate bringing that back. If council wishes to have help with messaging, I know that the staff can also provide that as well.
Excellent.
Mr. Chair, if you would indulge me one extra before we leave, and especially because she's here, I wanted to highlight the work of Assistant City Attorney Carol Bachun, who frequently labors behind the scenes. She is the attorney assigned to the clerk's office for pretty much everything. She is our expert in-house on open meetings. She does data practices. She does elections, redistricting. These are key things that the clerk's office brings forward, and as the council president said, they are very important in terms of how our governance operates at the city. It was Ms. Bachun who caught this issue and raised it to our attention, and has been really the driving force behind IGR, the clerk, and so many of the staff coming together in terms of organizing. We need a strategy. We need to do this now. This has multiple layers and is a highly nuanced issue that's going to require statutory change, charter change. It's going to affect how the council is chosen. So this is something that, absent her, I'm not sure that we would have had the timeline to be planful in this regard. It would have been a last minute, whoops, now we have to do this. So really grateful that Ms. Bachun keeps that close, careful eye on the details that really do matter and can have such significant consequence, and wanted to give her that public recognition in front of the committee while we're here.
Thank you. I'm glad you took a moment to recognize all the great work Ms. Bachun has done. Thank you. We're grateful for that. And also, I appreciate Council Vice President Jenkins talking about the communications element of this. I think when I have received questions about it from constituents, the point of confusion for a lot of them is that they think it changes our next upcoming regularly scheduled election, which it does not. It's really about after that, what happens. And so that's important for those who are communicating about it to hopefully convey across, and something that we're working on doing as well, so that people know exactly how it affects them. Any additional questions or comments? Not seeing any, so all those in favor of the motion, please say aye. Those opposed, that carries. And now we'll move on to our last item, which are our federal, state, and local legislative updates. Mr. Ranieri.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will be brief. It's been a while since we met, but there are a few things that happened.
And I appreciate this little note for those watching that the last two times, because of meeting timelines, we had to scrap the updates, so we're glad to get them.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, the first slide talks about federal issues, and some of these are fairly dated. The first thing I want to talk about is the immigration public charge. It's been implemented. There is a task force between state agencies, local agencies, many of our nonprofit agencies to get the word out to people about what's in the rule, what's not in the rule, because there's lots of concern within our immigrant community about what can we do? What is covered? What is not covered? And I know Ms. Rivera has been working on it with folks from many of the legal nonprofit groups and others. So I think that's underway. Next up, thank you. Next item is just basically the budget. And this was the president's budget, and often this budget doesn't get implemented. The president has been doing for years, eliminating things like CDBG, home, highway infrastructure money, and transit infrastructure. All of those things have been proposed before to be eliminated, and Congress has not followed suit. So I don't think that's going to happen. But we thought we'd let you know what is being proposed. At the state, when the last time we were going to meet, there was a January forecast, but collections saying that for receipts for January of this year, we're down about 9% below the forecast. They also concerned about the outlook maybe improving slightly for 2021, but maybe having a first quarter in 2020 being a little bit lower. And given the fact of the tariffs and the coronavirus, that may come to fruition. And tomorrow, the MMB, Office of Management and Budget at the state, is going to announce the revenue projection at about 11 o'clock. That will really tell how the rest of the session will go. Everyone's thinking it would maybe flat. We're not certain, but there is a surplus now. I think some people are counting on more. By about noon tomorrow, we'll get you an email letting you know what happened. At the state, yesterday was rather unusual. The legislature actually took the afternoon off to go to caucuses around the state because many members are 200-300 miles away. And so they took yesterday afternoon off and they took the morning off today so they can get back. And by doing that and a couple other things that are occurring, they've decided to extend the deadlines by a week. So we don't need to get things out of committees now until the March 20th, and the second deadline is March 27th. So it gives us more time to get things done. Another factor was that the reviser of statute was swamped and couldn't get things done as quickly as they usually do. It's just as a possible aside, there could be nearly 5,000 bills introduced this biennium, which would be a record. And it will only pass a couple hundred, and many of those include many bills, but 5,000 introduced and maybe a couple hundred wind up getting adopted. At the state, but you see the priorities of the House majority and the Senate majority, Social Security benefits in the majority in the Senate. This is against the Republican caucus. The House majority, they're looking for early childhood learning, additional funding, trying to make insulin affordable, paid family medical leave statewide, gun violence prevention and bonding. You can see that maybe the only thing that's really common between both bodies is bonding. But when you look into details, the House probably will propose to spend more than the Senate. The Senate numbers are closer to a little bit less than $1 billion. The House is over $2 billion. When they hopefully finish a bill, it'll probably be closer to $1.7 million to $2 billion. With our delegation, we did meet with Council President and our chair and the mayor on February 7th and went through several issues. They then asked us to leave so they could elect a chair. The chair is Representative Gomez. Yisha Gomez is chair of the delegation. Also, Representative Gomez was appointed to the Property Tax Division of the Tax Committee. She's a member of the full committee, but was not a member of the Property Tax Division. She is taking the place of Representative Loeffler. In terms of state government issues that we're working on, housing and lots of things dealing in the housing issue. Affordable housing, shelter housing. There's lots of discussion about shelter. There's a shelter bill moving along. And this would not just build shelters. It would be a comprehensive approach to shelter, basically starting the continuum of housing. There's also The builders are arguing about municipal fees and trying to take some authorities away from cities. Metro cities and the League of Cities is working on that. And the other one is renters' rights issues, and many of our delegation members are carrying that legislation in both the House and in the Senate. Hopefully we can see some movement. And there's also some ideas of maybe renters' rights and some of these benefits that people are asking for could be married together. So, and then in climate and change and energy, the stretch code discussion is still going on. There's lots of discussion about can we make our goals by 2036 in terms of carbon reduction. In taxes, last year the legislature said that if you want to have a local sales tax, you need to have a referenda, you need to also pass a resolution, and you need to come to them and get it approved. So for the last 2 sessions of the local tax committee, local property tax division, they've been hearing local tax bills from around the state. About 10 communities have already presented. Many are arguing that there are regional aspects to their tax, and their regional aspects are that many tourists come to their community or their students in their community, so that makes the regional impact. I don't know what's going to happen with those sales taxes. There may probably be 15 or 16 being considered by the House and Senate tax committees. And they will probably be, if there's going to be a tax bill, and I think there will be, we'll probably see those coming forward in early April. In the area of transportation, the major issue being discussed, at least in the last 2 weeks, has been metro transit, particularly light rail safety. Mr. Zelli Chair Zelli has spoke and talked about a plan that they're working on. They've had most of the hearings in the House, nothing in the Senate yet. That should be coming within the next week or two. So I think the big news will be tomorrow. What will be the forecast? Mr. Chairman, I'll stand for questions.
Excellent. Well, thank you for all the updates. Do we have any questions from committee members? Not seeing any, so I will go ahead and move that we receive and file that report. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those opposed, the motion carries. Thank you very much. With no further business before us, this meeting is adjourned.